In today's video, I'm teaching you literally everything you must know about how to play the opening 1e4 as white. And yes, we're covering every major black defense in this video, including how to play against 1e5, 1c5, 1e6, 1c6, d5, d6, knight f6, b6, b5, a6, and on and on and on. Literally every major black defense will be covered in this video. Now, let's go back to the very beginning. On move 1, white here has maybe 4 main first moves, those being e4, d4, c4, and knight to f3. But overall, e4 and d4 are by far the strongest and the most common first moves for white. However, if we had to pick one, overall, e4 has to be the most common first move for white at literally all levels of play, from 500 ELO all the way to 3000 plus ELO at online chess. And if we had to pick one, this one might actually be the strongest and best by test. More on that in just a little bit. Now, with 1e4, white is doing several things. First of all, he's threatening 2d4 on the very next move. For example, black plays a move like, I don't know, h5. Then 2d4 is by far the strongest option, seizing control of the center and getting 2 very strong pawns on d4 and e4. So that is the first threat by white. But beyond that, white here plays a very active move, and it activates this bishop on f1 and the queen on the d1 squares. The bishop and the queen both being very active now, and beyond that, white is setting up the idea of, for example, knight f3, bishop c4, and castling on the king side literally as soon as possible in the game. Overall, 1e4 is a very, very strong first move. It's very simple, very tactical, very aggressive, and if you're trying to find a good first move as white, you simply cannot go wrong with 1e4. It's one of the best moves as white for beginners, intermediate players, advanced players, even GMs, even Magnus Carlsen plays it quite a bit. It's just a fantastic overall first move from white. Now, the one drawback of this move is black has a lot, and I do mean a lot, of different defensive ideas. On move 1, black can play the moves, as discussed, e5, e6, d5, d6, c5, c6, b6, g6, knight f6, a6, b5, and on and on and on. There are a lot, and I mean a lot, of playable options for black. But if you're a beginner, don't worry. The 4 main responses by black are going to be e5, c5, e6, and c6. We will start with those and then cover the other sidelines. So these 4 moves here from black are the main ones, the strongest ones, and the ones you will see most often in your online games. Now, if we had to pick, the 2 best first moves for black against 1e4 are going to be e5 and c5. So let's start with the most classical option for black, that is the move e5. Now, this is called the open games, or 1e4, e5. It's a very solid option for black, and black so far is just mimicking white's opening on the first move. Now, why is this move so good for black? Well, it sort of stops white from going 2d4 on the next move. Yes, white can do that. However, if it goes 2d4, black takes the pawn, and white must take back with the queen, at which point the knight on b8 can go to c6, and black here is doing just fine. After all, he attacks the queen must move somewhere, and from there, black has very easy development, and black might actually be a little bit better out of the opening. So overall, when black goes e5, the move 2d4 doesn't work that well for white. Now, what else can white do besides 2d4? There are a lot of sidelines, but the main move overall for white is going to be knight to f3. That is the strongest move, the most classical move, the best overall move if you're trying to improve at online chess. Now, yes, there are other moves. You can go, for example, 2f4, the king's gambit, or 2 bishop c4, the bishop's opening, and you can go 2 knight to c3, the Vienna opening. However, overall, the strongest move and the simplest one and the best one for beginners to learn, of course, is going to be the classical idea of knight to f3. Now, why is this move so good for white? It's a multi-purpose move. First of all, you challenge the pawn on e5. You're threatening to win it in one move. If black were to waste a move like, I don't know, a5, you can just win the pawn immediately and get a huge edge. But beyond that, you're also setting up the idea of castling short on the king side very, very fast. And as you all know, if at all possible, you want to get your king on the e1 square castled as soon as you can. And this is especially important in the open games after 1e4, e5, as very often the game just open up very fast. And your king really does belong on g1, castled on the king side as soon as possible. So overall, knight f3 is a very good move. Now, what does black do in response? The 3 main moves for black are going to be knight c6, defending e5, knight f6, counterattacking on e4, and d6. Beyond that, there are moves like f5 and d5, which black can play, but don't worry, against both of these options, f5, we take on the e5 square, preparing bishop c4, and white gets a very good game. And against d5, same thing. We take on e5, setting up potentially bishop c4 ideas later in the opening if black were to say take on e4, and white again gets a very, very easy game. So the main moves again, knight c6, knight f6, and d6. Let's start with d6. This move is the Philidor defense. It's not that strong. Black does defend e5 with the pawn, but overall it's not the most ambitious idea, and white can simply go d4, gaining space and getting a fantastic game. As a general rule of thumb, in these 1e4, e5 openings, going d4 is okay if we have that knight on f3 supporting the pawn. That way, if black takes, we take back with the knight, and our queen is still on d1, and it cannot be harassed. Overall, this opening for white is pretty easy. Now, beyond that, black can also go knight f6, the Pirc defense, counterattacking on the pawn on the e4 square. Against the Pirc, the strongest lines for white include taking on the e5 square right away, and d4. But overall, taking on e5 is probably the strongest line for white. From here, the main line goes d6, driving back the knight. There are others. We'll cover it in the other videos in this series, but d6, knight f3, knight takes, and then white has two main lines. The absolute main line, the strongest line for white, is going to involve going d4, and then bishop d3, and castles. And from there, challenging this knight on e4 with moves like rook e1, knight to c3, knight bd2, and so on. Now, the other option, a line that is also very strong, in fact, Gukesh recently won a very high-level game in this line. It is the move knight to c3, challenging this knight. And if black goes back, that is good for white. Black's play is a little bit passive overall. And beyond that, if black takes on c3, the main line, white takes back with the d-pawn like this, setting up the idea of bishop e3, queen d2, and long castles, getting a very, very aggressive setup. And overall, black should be okay in these lines, but it is a lot of fun for white to play, and white does still have decent chances for an edge out of the opening. So that is how to beat the Pirc defense with knight f6. Now, if black goes knight to c6 like this, then there are maybe four main ideas right now at all levels of play. Those four ideas are bishop c4, bishop b5, d4, and knight to c3. Now, all of these are playable. The two main moves for white are going to be bishop c4, the Italian opening, and bishop b5, the Ruy Lopez. Instead, d4 and knight c3 are more sidelines, but they're also playable for white. Let's start with the sidelines. If d4, this is called the Scotch opening. The main idea being we're trying to fight for the center right away on move 3. The main line goes taking on d4, white takes back, and from there, white's got slightly better control of the center with his pawn on the e4 square and a better knight, but overall, black here should be okay. He can continue knight f6 or bishop c5. Both moves are playable, and it's sort of a tense fight from there. The other sideline for white is going to be knight c3. This is called the four knights variation, as black most often does go knight f6, and we have four knights here in the center of the board. Now, there are two main lines here for white, bishop to b5 and d4. If white goes d4, it's sort of like the Scotch opening, and from there, the main line continues bishop b4, knight takes c6, b takes, bishop d3, d5, e takes, c takes, castles, castles. And don't worry, we'll cover that more in later videos, but overall, this opening is pretty solid. It's about equal, but white does have some ideas, and some white players do go for it. And the benefit is it's a very, very simple line overall for white to play. Beyond that, white can also go in this position bishop b5, the so-called four knights Ruy Lopez, which, and the GOAT Magnus Carlsen himself recently won a very nice game in this very line. It's not better for white, but it is solid. White castles the next move, and overall it is playable, so it's an option. Beyond that, of course, white can also go for the two main lines, bishop c4 and bishop b5. Now, if you are a beginner and you're just starting as white with 1e4, I highly, highly recommend the move 3 bishop c4, the Italian opening. In my opinion, this is the best opening for white after 1e4, e5 overall, especially in blitz. And if you had to learn one opening as white after e4, e5, this is it. It's the Italian opening. Now, the Italian is a very simple but very strong opening for white, and the idea is simple. White here brings out the bishop to a very good diagonal, pressuring f7, the weakest point in the black camp. At some point, white may go, for example, knight g5, targeting the weak pawn, but beyond that, white can simply castle, And then from there, he's got a couple of ideas. For example, if bishop c5, white can castle. And from there, white's main ideas include c3 and d4 right away, getting a very strong pawn center, or he can go c3 and d3, playing more of a quiet positional game, which is super, super common at the GM level. It's a very strong, flexible opening for white overall. Now, beyond that, white can also go 3 bishop b5, the Ruy Lopez opening. Now, for a very long time, this was the main line after e4 or e5, and in fact, Bobby Fischer, Gary Kasparov, and all the old masters, they mostly played this line, the Ruy Lopez. However, in recent years, computers have shown a number of interesting ideas for white in the Italian, and today the Italian is, I would say, as common as the Ruy Lopez overall, but the Ruy Lopez also a very, very strong option. Now, what is the idea with Ruy Lopez? White here, with this move, pressures the weak knight on c6, which does defend e5, so white is sort of trying to remove the defender of the pawn on the e5 square, and beyond that, white again can castle on the very next move. Now, very importantly, this pawn on the e5 square is not hanging yet. For example, if black were to challenge this bishop with a6, white can trade on c6, black can take back with the d-pawn, and if white is dumb enough to capture on the e5 square, black has a number of ideas here, including queen d4, forking the knight and the pawn. He can also go queen g5, hitting the knight and the pawn on the g2 square. So either of these moves, especially queen d4, is very strong, and white is a little bit worse. For example, queen d4, knight f3, queen takes. Black wins back the pawn with arguably a much better game, and potentially a better endgame like this. So white's idea is not to win the pawn on e5 right away. Instead, we're applying some positional pressure on that knight, and from there, white's ideas include castling and potentially going c3 and d4, again, getting a very strong pawn on d4, supported by the c-pawn. And overall, the Ruy Lopez is a very deep, rich, positional, and tactical opening. It's a little more complicated than the Italian opening. If you are a beginner, the Italian with 3 bishop c4 is likely a little simpler, but 3 bishop b5, the Ruy Lopez is also a very main line, a very, very good, rich, deep opening. That covers 1 e4, e5 territory. Now let's talk about the dreaded Sicilian defense with the move 1 c5. Now, what is black's idea with the move 1 c5? It's very simple. Again, black is trying to control d4 and stop white from going to d4 right away. If white does that, black takes back with the pawn like this, white takes, and then bang, knight c6 once again hits the queen with tempo, and because black has that tempo on the queen, black here is a little bit better. For example, if queen d1, knight f6, and all of a sudden black is a little bit ahead in development. He has 2 pieces out versus the 0 of white, and black is overall a little bit better. So black's move, 1 c5, the main idea is to control d4 and stop white from going to d4 on the very next move. Now, of course, white does not have to go to d4. There are much stronger options. Now, the main line here for white, just like with 1 e5, is going to be the move knight to f3. Now, from here, white threatens d4. That is called the open Sicilian. And against literally any move by black, 3d4 is going to be an option. Now, black's main moves here are knight c6, d6, and e6. But black also has other ideas like g6, b6, a6, and so on. But against most of them, for example, d6, the move 3d4 is very, very strong. Black takes, white takes back, and this is the basic idea of the open Sicilian. White here gets a very strong knight on d4, and the other knight can go to c3 if he wants to. And from there, the other knight can go to c3 like this. Now, this line is very flexible for white. White has many ideas. For example, you can castle on the king side with, say, bishop e2 and castles. You can also castle on the queen side with, say, knight c3, bishop e3, queen d2, and long castles. So white does have a lot of options here. There are many, many setups. Now, I do want to point out, if black goes for this line with knight c6, the move 3d4 is good, but there might actually be a stronger option. And that is the move 3 bishop b5, which is the so-called Rosolino variation of the Sicilian defense. Now, this position right here, it's almost like a Ruy Lopez, except black's pawn is on c5 instead of e5. Imagine this pawn went back to c7 and this one to e5. We'd literally have a Ruy Lopez opening. So instead, the e pawn's on e7 and the c pawn is on c5, and overall, This is a little bit better for white, a little bit, but not much. So white has decent chances for an edge here out of the opening. Now, white's ideas from here, he has two main ideas. One is the Roy Lopez style strategy of castles, and then c3 and d4. For example, say g6, castles, bishop g7, c3, intending d4. That is one option. The other option for white is actually trading on c6 with the bishop. For example, g6 and trading on c6, damaging black's pawn structure, and no matter what black does, taking with the b pawn or say the d pawn, white's going to have very good chances to control the center and just generally have good play against these double pawns on the c file. Now, going back to this position, if black goes d6 instead of knight c6, the move bishop e5 is also quite good for white. So this is an option even against d6. It's called the Moscow variation. White's idea here is very simple. We give a nice check on b5 to the king on the e8 square, and from there we can castle pretty fast. For example, if black blocks the check with bishop d7, we trade and then castle. If black goes knight c6, we just castle. And if knight d7, we just castle again. So overall, a very simple idea for white. And from there, you can go, for example, for a straight d4 or a c3 d4 idea. Even a c4 d4 idea is playable for white in these positions. So, as white, against one c5, e4, c5, knight f3 is the main move. If black goes knight c6, bishop b5 is probably strongest, but d4 is also good. So knight c6, bishop b5 being strongest, but d4 is also quite good for whites. Against d6, d4 is strongest. However, bishop b5 is also a very solid idea. And against e6, finally, the move d4 is strongest, but a backup option, if you don't like that, is going to be c3, as I show in just a little bit. Now, knight f3 is by far the main move, but if you're a beginner, that may be a little bit too complicated for you. And if you want a simpler option, the simpler option is going to be simply to c3. This is called the Alekhine variation. The idea is you're trying to go d4 right away as white on move 2. And for example, black were to waste a move like h5. Then d4 would be very, very strong for white. If black takes, you take back. And suddenly, you get those two strong pawns on d4 and e4, which is really the entire goal of any one e4 opening player. Now, black, of course, will not go h5 unless he's literally Magnus Carlsen trying to troll you. So instead, the two main ideas for black here are going to be d5 and knight to f6. If black goes d5, you take the pawn, he takes back, and from there, white's idea is, for example, knight f3, intending d4, and a fast, short castles. Instead, if black does go knight to f6 here, the challenge with that move for white is the pawn on the e4 square is under attack, and there isn't really a good way to defend the pawn. d3 is passive, queen c2 is strange, bishop d3 blocks the d-pawn, and f3 is suicide strategically. Therefore, the only good move here for white is going to be e5, driving back this knight, and as black, the main move is knight d5. From there, we go d4, gaining control of the center, and it's an interesting line. White can go, for example, knight f3, bishop c4, castles, and so on, and overall, it's a very simple, playable line for white. If you don't like the open Sicilian, this is the line for you. And by the way, if you don't want to play the open Sicilian, but you don't like this line per se, you can also go knight f3, and against knight c6, bishop e5 is good. Against d6, bishop e5 is good. And against e6, if you don't want to go d4, in that case, c3 again, intending d4 is quite good, as black will probably go d5, you take, he takes back, d4, and overall, white here has a pretty solid setup. And that covers pretty much everything you must know about how to play 1e4 c5, at least from a high-level overview standpoint. Now, beyond e5 and c5, black can also play the other main lines, those being the French defense and the Caro-Kann defense. Let's start with the French defense. The French defense is a very interesting opening. The idea is black wants to go d5 with the d5 pawn supported. For example, if white wastes a move like h3, then the idea is d5, and if white ever takes on d5, that pawn is supported by the other pawn. Now, the main move here for white, and the one I think you should play, is the move d4, gaining space. And as black, the main move by far is going to be d5. All right, from here, what should white be doing? Well, real fast, to kind of give you an... Now, from here, as white, what should you be doing in the main lines of the French defense? Well, real fast, I do want to point this out. The main pawn structure in the French defense is this pawn structure when white goes for the move e5. This is called the advanced variation of the French defense, and this pawn structure with the pawns on e5, d4, d5, and e6 is very, very thematic. White here has more space on the king side, and his main idea is to attack somehow on this side of the board. Meanwhile, black, his main plan is to pressure the weak pawn on d4 with the move c5, either right away or at some point, and moves like knight c6, queen b6, and so on, pressuring d4, and maybe even the move f6 later, attacking this pawn as well. So in the French, white often gets a very strong pawn center with pawns on d4 and e5, and it can attack on the king side, with the king being over here attacking the king. However, black does get very good counterplay with moves like c5 and f6 later in the game. Now, as white right here, there are four main options. There is the main line, knight c3, the other main line, knight d2, there is the advanced variation, which many players are playing these days. I quite like it for white myself. And finally, there is the exchange variation taking on d5. Let's cover all those one by one. The simplest option by far is the exchange variation taking on d5. The main line goes e takes, and from there, white's idea is knight f3, bishop d3, and castles, getting very simple development, although Hikaru himself plays quite a bit of knight f3 and then 5c4 in this opening as white. For example, knight f6 and then c4. He plays this quite a bit in Title Tuesday, for example, and it is a playable idea. The idea being, if black takes, we take back. And white has a decent version of the isolated d-pawn. More on that later in the middle game guide I'm pumping out as well. Now, the exchange is the simplest line, but it's not the strongest. The strongest lines for white in the French are e5, knight d2, and the strongest of them all, knight to c3. Now, e5 is a very solid line for white. It's called the advanced variation, as white is advancing this pawn to the e5 square. And again, black's main idea is to counterplay here includes c5 and later in the game f6. As white, the main way to develop includes knight f3, bishop e2, and castles. For example, the main line goes c5, c3, knight c6, knight f3, bishop d7, bishop e2, intending castling. And from there, white has many, many ideas. You can develop, you can bring this knight to, say, c2 and defend d4. You can go a3 and b4. You can go in some lines h4, h5, attacking on the king side. There are a lot, and I mean a lot of ideas there. But overall, the main line involves going knight f3, bishop e2, and short castles. Now beyond that, there is knight d2, the Tarrasch variation. The idea behind this, black here is threatening the pawn on the e4 square, and knight d2 does defend the pawn. And the reason some players play this instead of the more active knight c3 is if white goes knight c3, black has the option of going bishop b4, pinning this knight on c3 to the king on the e1 square. However, with the move knight d2 instead, if black does go bishop b4, then bada boom bada bang, c3 blocks the attack, gains a tempo on the bishop, and white has a much, much better game. Therefore, black will normally go for moves like knight f6 or c5. If c5, the main line goes, for example, taking on d5 and so on. And instead, if knight f6, then we get a very typical French defense pawn structure with the move e5, knight fd7, and so on. And from here, white's idea is typically to castle on the king side. He might go knight f3 or knight to e2 and knight d to f3. There are a lot of ideas here for white, but overall, the idea is trying to castle on the king side as soon as you can, and then go c3 in response to c5. Now, finally, there's the absolute main line, that being knight c3, the classical variation, and this move is the one you'll see most often at the grandmaster level. Now, it is very strong, but it is also very, very complicated. There's a lot of theory here. If you want a simpler option, the move e5 on move 3 might be a little bit simpler. If you are a die-hard maximalist, you want the biggest possible advantage after 1e4, then the move knight c3 is the move for you. Now, black here has three main responses. Those are taking on e4, like this. By the way, in the Tarrasch, black can also take on e4. We'll cover it via the knight c3 move order. So, knight c3, black can either take on e4, go bishop b4, or go knight f6. And yes, there are other options. There is knight c6, for example. There is h6. There are other options, but the main lines by far are taking on e4, bishop b4, and knight to f6. First of all, black takes on e4, d takes e4. That is the Rubinstein variation, like this. And from there, white's idea is pretty simple overall. White wants to go knight f3, bishop d3, and castles, getting a very simple development scheme. For example, if black goes knight d7, knight f3, knight f6, bishop d3, bishop b7, castles, and from there white can go, for example, rook to e1 or queen d2, maybe c3, and so on, bishop f4, and white's got a very, very simple game with a solid edge out of the opening. Now, instead, if black goes for the dreaded Winawer variation with the move bishop b4, this is the Winawer line. This line is very, very, very complicated. If you want a simple line to avoid the complications, what you do is you take on the d5 square, black takes back, and you develop and castle like this. Instead, if you are ready for a fight, the move for white is e5. Now from here, the main line continues. c5, putting pressure on d4. White goes a3, challenging the bishop. Black takes, and white takes back. And this pawn structure is the famous Winawer variation pawn structure, and it leads to very, very weird battles, to be honest. Black's main idea is to pressure d4 and pressure these weak pawns on the c-file. Meanwhile, white has two options. You can either play a more slow positional battle with moves like knight f3, a4, bishop d3, and so on, or you can bring the fight to black immediately with moves like queen to g4, pressuring g7, for example, knight e7, queen to g4, pressuring g7, or you can play the AlphaZero line, which was actually popularized by AlphaZero himself versus Stockfish in 2017 with the move h4, intending h5, and then queen g4, pressuring g7. So either option is fine. The positional play with, for example, knight f3, bishop d3, a4, and so on, or the attacking play with moves like queen g4 or h4, h5, and then queen g4. And the lines there run very, very deep. We'll cover that more in a separate video about how to play versus the French defense as white. Now, finally, there is the classical variation with the move knight to f6, which this is probably the main line for black these days versus 3 knight c3. Now from here, the main move for white is going to be e5, pushing back this knight. Black pretty much has to go to d7, g4 hangs the knight, h5 hangs the knight, g8 is way too passive, so d7 is the only real move. And from here, white has two main ideas. The first one, arguably the strongest one, is f4. So white here is gaining space on the king side, and the main line continues c5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop e3, and from here, white can castle on either side of the board. You can go king side with, for example, bishop to e2 or d3, and then castles. You can also castle on the queen side with queen d2 and then long castles. Both options are fully playable, and black has many, many ideas in response. Beyond that, oh, and by the way, real fast, wherever the white king goes, white's main idea in this pawn structure is to attack on the king side. Maybe with f5, pressuring e6, opening the f-file. Maybe with h4, h5, h6, weakening g6, and so on. But whatever white does, he's usually trying to attack on the king side, and usually I'd say with the move f5 at some point, trying to weaken e6, open up the f-file, and so on. Now, instead of this line, white can also go for a line in this position with the move knight c to e2, and Gukesh D actually used this line versus Ding Liren in their 2024 World Championship match, meaning it is a very, very strong common line for white as well. And the idea is if black does go c5, we can defend d4 with the c-pawn like this, and then go knight f3, knight g3 if needed, bishop d3 and castles, or there's even the more modern idea of a fast h4, h5 in the spear of AlphaZero himself. So either way does work for white. And that pretty much covers how to play versus the French defense, which leads us to the Caro-Kann defense with e4 and then c6. Now, the main move for white is going to be d4, although there are two main alternatives, including knight to c3 and knight to f3. We'll cover those in just a little bit. d4 is the main move for white, d5 is the move for black, And from here, white has several different options. Let's consider e5, knight c3, e takes d5, and f3. Let's start with e5. This is called the advanced variation. It is the strongest line overall for white. And if white is trying to achieve the biggest possible advantage out of the opening, this is the line that you play as white. And it's also the one I play myself as white, but not very important. Now here as black, there are two main responses. Well, first of all, as white, what are we trying to do? We're trying to gain space in the center and get two very strong pawns on e5 and d4. Besides that, we're trying to castle on the king side as fast as we can with moves like knight f3, bishop to somewhere, one of these squares somewhere, and castling on the king side and going from there. Black, in response, the main advantage of this line versus the French defense is black can actually go bishop f5 here, as the e6 pawn does not block in the bishop. By the way, real fast, in the French defense, black's biggest single weakness in lines like this is going to be that bishop on c8, which is blocked inside its own pawns. Now, in the Caro-Kann, interestingly enough, if white goes e5, the bishop is not blocked in by the pawn, as the pawn is still on the e7 square. Therefore, one of black's two main ideas right here is going to be bishop f5. Beyond that, black can also go c5, counterattacking immediately on the queen side. If black goes here, bishop f5, white has two main ideas in response. There is the aggressive tall variation with the move h4, intending a fast g4, trying to trap the bishop. And beyond that, there is the short variation where white simply goes knight f3, bishop e2, and castles, getting his king to safety as fast as possible. Now, if black goes c5, things get very, very tactical. Black's idea is putting immediate pressure on this pawn on d4. From here, white has many, many ideas, taking on c5, knight f3, and so on, c3. There are a lot of options. It's a very complicated, very fun line for both sides. Now, beyond e5, there are other options for white. Knight c3 is very good. Knight d2 does the same thing, defends the e4 pawn like this. Beyond that, moves like f3 and even e takes d5 are also playable. Knight c3 used to be perhaps the main line for white, the idea being you support the e4 pawn, as in the spirit of the French defense line with 3 knight c3. From there, the main line goes d takes, knight takes, and from there, white's idea is pretty simple. Knight f3, bishop d3, and castles, or castling long on the queen side with moves like bishop to f4, queen e2, and long castles. In response, black has many ideas as well, including the main lines of knight d7, intending knight to f6, or bishop f5, or even immediately knight to f6, which is a little riskier, but black can play it as well. So black has many ideas in response, and overall, this is probably the simplest, easiest line for beginners. White's play is pretty standard, pretty typical, pretty straightforward. Now, white can also go for the move f3 here, defending e4. It's called the fantasy variation, which I do admit is a slightly weird name for an opening variation in chess, but that's what we get, the fantasy variation. The idea is you defend e4, and overall, I don't like this line for beginners. It is actually quite strong for white, but the problem is this pawn move, it blocks f3, and therefore knight to f3 is not possible, and it does make white's development overall a little bit awkward, although you can play it. Arjun Erigaisi himself, the Indian Tiger, did play it recently as white, so it is a very playable idea. Beyond that, the move e takes d5 is also playable, and from there, white's main idea, for example, could be knight f3, bishop e2 or d3, and castles, and from there, maybe c3 or c4, getting play on the queen side. Now, finally, against the Caro-Kann, there are two other options which are also quite playable. There is the two knights variation with knight c3, d5, and then knight to f3, defending e4 with the pawn. And the main line may go, for example, taking on e4, knight takes, and so on. And white can go, for example, maybe d4, maybe bishop d3, maybe castles. It's a playable line. And also, black can also go bishop g4 here, pinning this knight. There, the main line goes h3, bishop takes, queen takes, e6, and black gets the so-called famous pawn triangle the first time in our video lesson here. And again, white can continue bishop e2 or g3, bishop g2, and castles. Now, beyond that, there's one last very strong line for white. Not very strong, but pretty strong overall, I'd say. And that is the endgame variation with knight f3, d5, and then d3. The idea being if black wants it, he can force an endgame with d takes, queen takes, king takes, which, despite having the king on d1, white still has decent chances to apply some long-term pressure in the endgame. And overall, despite having the king on d1, despite losing the right to castle, white is actually doing pretty well here overall, and white may have some chances to apply some long-term pressure on the black position. So that covers the main ideas for white in the Caro-Kann. Again, to review, there is the endgame line, knight f3, d5, d3. There's the three knights variation, knight c3, d5, knight f3. And in the main line, there is the strongest line, e5, the very solid knight c3 or d2, intending capturing on e4, the taking on d5 line, the exchange line, and finally, the fantasy line with the move f3. Now, that covers the four main defenses to 1e4 from black, that being e5, c5, e6, and c6. Beyond that, black does have a wide variety of sidelines. Let's cover all of those one by one. First of all, there is the Scandinavian defense with move 1, d5. Black's idea is simple: counterattack on d5, pressuring the pawn on the e4 square, and if white takes the pawn, black most likely will take back with the queen like this. Now from here, the main line for white is knight c3, attacking the queen, and now the queen has at least three good squares. a5 is the main line, but d6 and d8 are also playable, and beyond that, black can also go for moves like queen to e5 or e6. There are a lot of options here, but overall, the one move black should not do is queen c6, as you don't have to be a very stable chess genius to realize that loses to bishop b5, and the queen is pinned already on move 4. So, the main line for black is queen to a5. From there, white can continue d4, knight f3, and then try to castle either on the king side with moves like bishop e2 or d3 or c4 and castles, or on the queen side with moves like bishop to d2, bishop c4, queen to e2, and long castles. And white's ideas in this line are very, very aggressive. There's a lot to cover here, but that is the main idea. And if black goes queen d6, there white has many options. Usually white continues d4, knight f6, knight f3, and white's ideas here include bishop c4 and castles, or even g3, bishop g2, castles, and bishop f4, attacking the queen on d6. Now that should get you started in the Scandinavian defense. Let's see, how about the Alekhine's, the Alekhine's opening with move 1, knight to f6. If black plays this, white's strongest move, of course the pawn on e4 is under attack, the strongest move for white is going to be e4, gaining space, pressuring the weak knight. Black's main move here is knight d5. Again, it can't go here, you lose the knight. You can't go here, you lose the knight. And while you can go back here, black does that. All you have to do as white is simply d4, gaining space, and white is much, much, much better. So, knight d5 is the main move. White usually goes d4, black usually goes d6, both sides trying to fight for control of the center. And from there, white has two main ideas. The two strongest lines for white include the classical line, which involves going knight f3, bishop e2, and castles. A very simple, very solid line. For example, knight f3, bishop to e2, castles, something like this. There's also the more aggressive line, and this one is very aggressive. It is the four pawns attack involving c4, knight b6, and f4. White literally getting four very aggressive pawns out in the center, and this line does work. White's idea from here is knight c3, knight f3, bishop to, say, e2, and castles like this. And overall, white does have a pretty solid edge there, but the game is very, very complicated. Now, what about other moves like d6, the Pirc defense? From here, white goes d4, and the main line for black is knight to f6. Now, in the Pirc defense, black's idea is simple. He wants to go g6, bishop g7, and castles, which is sort of in the spirit of the King's Indian defense opening. More on that in our 1d4 overview for white. Now, here, what should white be doing? Well, obviously, this pawn on e4 is under attack. We begin knight c3, black goes g6, and from there, white has two main options. You can either castle on the king's side, for example, knight f3, intending bishop e2 and castles in one line. The other option is castle on the queen side with moves like, for example, bishop to e3 and then queen d2 and then long castles. So either option is fine. Now, the safe line for white is simply castling king side with moves like this, castles, and from there, white can continue. For example, h3, bishop e3, queen d2, rook e1, rook d1, a4, maybe even d5 or e5 later in the game. It's a very, very solid line for white. Very strong, very simple, very good. Now, the more aggressive line is to castle queenside. And yes, there are more lines than this, but they're the two main ideas, castling kingside or castling queenside. A good line for castling queenside is, of course, bishop e3, intending queen d2 and long castles. The main line going bishop g7, then queen d2, and white can castle long on the next move if he wants to. And from there, both sides will launch attacks on the opponent's king. Black on the queen side with moves like a6, b5, b4, and white on the king side with moves like f3, g4, h4, h5, and so on. Now, going back to move 1, e4. We covered almost everything. What about move 1, g6, the modern defense? The modern defense is just like the Pirc defense, except the knight on g8 does not move off g8, at least for right now. The main line goes d4, bishop g7, knight c3, d6. And now from here, white has many options. Again, you can castle kingside with moves like knight f3, bishop e2, and castles. That is the safe, solid, bulletproof line. But as usual, you can castle long with moves like bishop e3, queen d2, and long castles. Overall, it's quite similar to the Pirc defense in terms of white's and black's options. Now, finally, what else can black do? Black can also go for moves like b6, a6, and b5. Now, these lines are not that strong. It's not too important. If b6, white goes d4, black goes bishop b7, and from there, moves like knight to c3 or bishop d3, defending e4 are the main lines, and a very, very cool trap. Here, the strongest line for white is bishop d3, and if black goes f5, the idea behind this move, it's sort of a weird, dubious idea, but you might face it online. If black goes f5, black here is trying to remove the defender of the g2 pawn. If white takes, black can take back on g2, but it turns out taking is the right move for white. The main line goes bishop takes g2, and then bada boom bada bang, the Hikaru queen comes out to the h5 square. So queen h5 hits the king on e8, g6, we take. And from here, white has an absolutely deadly attack on the black king. White can even give up the rook on h1. For example, bishop takes is met by g7, checkmate against the black king. Very cool stuff. But overall, against b6, d4 is the move, bishop b7, and then bishop d3 or knight c3, most likely intending a fast castling on the king side. For example, bishop d3, e6, knight f3, trying to castle. That is the main line there for white. Now, if black goes a6, the St. George defense, then we just go d4 like this. And if b5, here white has many ideas. You can go, for example, for a fast a4 attacking this pawn, but the simpler option overall is simply knight f3, intending bishop d3, and then castles like this. And from there, maybe, I don't know, rook e1, c3, knight d2 to f1 to g3, bishop e3, queen d2, h3, something like that. And don't worry, we'll cover all of this later in later lessons as well. Now, here's a bonus, real fast. A lot of players ask me, Mike, what do you do if the opponent makes weird moves? Like, what do you do if the opponent goes for, I don't know, the cow opening, for example, which the cow opening for black was popularized by Anna Kramling, and the idea is black goes e6, d6, knight e7, knight g6, knight d7, knight b6, bishop e7, bishop d7, kind of like this, for example. Let's waste some moves for white. Let's show the cow opening. What do you do as white if black plays some weird stuff like this versus your 1e4? What is the idea for white? What's the strongest response? Well, don't worry. It's actually quite simple. As usual, white's idea is control the center, go e4, d4, and castle kingside or queenside, and then attack. Let's see how it's done. On move 1, if white goes e4, and black goes e6, then d4, and if black goes for the cow opening or any other weird sideline idea, like this, whatever it is, the hippo, the cow, whatever you want to call it, the main strategy, to keep it very, very simple, is to castle kingside or queenside, and then attack. For example, I personally love to castle queenside here. My plan is so simple, knight c3, then bishop e3, then queen d2, and then long castles. And from here, we can attack. We can go king b1 first, and then, for example, maybe f4 to e5, or maybe h4, h5, or knight f3, h4, h5, or whatever. You basically castle kingside or queenside, and then attack the opponent. That is the very, very short answer for how to play versus weird opening moves versus your 1e4 opening. So that covers literally every major opening from 1e4, including e5, c5, e6, c6, d5, d6, g6, knight f6, b6, b5, a6, and so on. Every opening was covered in this video by now. You should have plenty of options for what to play as white after 1e4 versus literally any opening from black, including even the cow opening. I even covered that for you guys. So that's all for this video. Let me know down below in the comments what you thought of the video. And as always, I wish you the best of luck in your chess improvement journey in 2025 and beyond. And God bless, and I'll see you in the next video.